Vincent Moretti adjusted the onyx cufflinks that cost more than most men earned in a decade, his gaze fixed on the rain-slicked streets of Chicago through the bulletproof glass of his armored Rolls-Royce Phantom. Beside him, Natasha Sinclair was droning on about the seating chart for their upcoming wedding, a strategic merger of empires that would solidify his stranglehold on the city's shipping routes, but he heard nothing but the dull buzz of apathy. She was perfect on paper, ruthless, wealthy, and utterly devoid of warmth, exactly what a Dawn needed to maintain power without the messy complication of feelings. "My father insists on the Plaza for the reception," Natasha said, checking her reflection in the darkened window, oblivious to the fact that she was marrying a man who felt more for his tailored suit than he did for her. "He says it's the only venue that can accommodate the senator and the 500 guests necessary to show the families were united." Vincent didn't bother to reply, his mind already drifting to the port negotiations scheduled for dawn, until the traffic light turned red and the world outside the armored sanctuary ground to a halt. The crosswalk filled with the evening rush, a sea of gray coats and tired faces, but one figure cut through the monotony like a knife to the gut. She was struggling with a rusted double stroller, one wheel wobbling violently as she fought against the slush and the biting wind, her frame so thin that her oversized, threadbare coat looked like it was swallowing her whole. Vincent's heart, a muscle he'd trained to be as cold as the steel he carried, hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs because he knew that auburn hair, messy and pulled back in a desperate ponytail. It was Scarlett, the woman he'd forced out of his life 14 months ago to save her from the target painted on his back, only now she looked wrecked, with deep purple bruises of exhaustion under her eyes. She wasn't just walking, she was trudging, shivering in a jacket that wouldn't stop a breeze, let alone a Chicago winter, pushing a carriage that looked like she'd dragged it out of a dumpster. She paused in the middle of the street to tuck a blanket around two tiny, swarming bundles, her hands red and raw from the cold as she kissed a small forehead with a tenderness that shattered him. The timeline crashed into his mind with the force of a physical blow. He had left her 14 months ago, exactly enough time for a pregnancy and 4 months of life he knew nothing about. These weren't just random children, they were twins, wrapped in thin blankets that offered no real protection, staring up at a mother who looked like she hadn't eaten a full meal since the night he abandoned her. "Vincent, the light is green," Natasha snapped, her voice grating against his sudden devastation, but he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't tear his eyes away from the rearview mirror. He was the most powerful man in the city, sitting on a throne of blood and billions, while the woman he loved was drowning in poverty with his heirs in a broken stroller. "Vincent." Natasha's voice was a serrated blade cutting through the fog of his shock, her manicured hand tapping impatiently on his arm as she pointed to the green light. He blinked, the image of Scarlett's red, raw knuckles burned into his retinas, and for a split second, he wanted to open the door and sprint into the freezing traffic. Instead, he forced his jaw to unclench and tap the glass partition, signaling his driver to move, though every instinct in his body screamed at him to stop. As the heavy car surged forward, Vincent twisted in his seat, watching the woman he loved shrink into a small, dark speck against the gray slush of the sidewalk. She pushed the stroller with a limp, her head bowed against the wind, a solitary figure fighting a war he had left her to fight alone. Finally, Natasha huffed, checking her diamond earrings in the mirror again, oblivious to the fact that the man beside her was currently watching his entire world crumble. "You really need to speak to the driver about his reaction times, Vincent. It's embarrassing." The Michelin star restaurant loomed ahead, a beacon of warmth and exclusivity where the city's elite pretended to be civilized, but to Vincent, it looked like a prison. He couldn't stomach the thought of 7 courses and polite conversation about mergers when the image of those thin blankets was looping in his mind. "I'm not coming in," he said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears, rough and hollow like he had swallowed glass. Natasha froze with her hand on the door handle, turning to look at him with a mixture of shock and fury that would have terrified a lesser man. "Excuse me? We have a reservation. The senator is expecting us." Vincent didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the leather seat in front of him as he poured a glass of whiskey from the console just to stop his hands from shaking. "Something came up," he lied, though it was the truest thing he had ever said. "Go. Make my excuses. Tell them business waits for no one." She slammed the door hard enough to shake the heavy frame, but Vincent didn't flinch as the Rolls-Royce pulled away from the curb and slipped back into the night. He downed the amber liquid in one burning gulp, but it did nothing to chase away the cold that had settled deep in his marrow. 14 months. He counted them again, ticking off the agonizing days since he had stood in her tiny kitchen and told the only lie that mattered. He had told her he didn't love her, that she was a distraction, that she wasn't cut out for his world of blood and shadows. He had crushed her heart to save her life because Richard Blackwood had whispered her name as a threat, and Vincent knew he couldn't protect her if she was close to him. He had convinced himself she would move on, find a nice accountant, maybe move to the suburbs and have a safe, boring life with a man who didn't carry a gun to dinner. He never imagined she would be alone, shivering in the dead of winter, pushing 2 babies that looked exactly like the family he had denied himself. The Moretti estate sat on the highest hill in the district, a sprawling fortress of stone and glass that looked down on the city like a silent judge. The gates swung open with a mechanical hum, admitting him into a world of perfectly manicured hedges and security lights that cost more to run than Scarlett likely made in a year. Vincent stepped out of the car and the silence of the house hit him, vast and oppressive, smelling of lemon polish and loneliness. He walked past the grand staircase where he had once imagined Scarlett standing in a silk gown, a fantasy he had killed with his own hands. Now, walking through the marble hallway, all he could see was the water soaking into her canvas shoes and the way she had taped the handle of that stroller with gray duct tape. He felt like a fraud, a king ruling over a kingdom of ash while his queen was out there begging for scraps. He bypassed the master bedroom and went straight to his study, a room lined with books he never read and secrets that kept the city running. He didn't turn on the lights, preferring the darkness that matched the storm raging inside his chest as he poured another drink he didn't need. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the glittering skyline of Chicago, wondering which tiny, dark window out there belonged to her. Was she warm now? Did she have food for those babies? The questions were torture devices, twisting tighter with every second of silence until he couldn't breathe. He grabbed the secure phone on his desk, his fingers leaving smudges on the polished wood, and dialed the one number he knew would answer at any hour. Marco picked up on the first ring, his voice crisp and alert, trained to expect disaster at 2 in the morning. "Boss," Marco said, the background noise of the security center humming behind him. "Is everything secure?" Vincent gripped the phone so hard the plastic creaked, his reflection in the glass looking like a stranger, pale and haunted. "I need a locate," Vincent said, his voice dropping to a register that made his men sweat. "Scarlett Morgan." "I want everything, Marco. Current address, place of employment, financial records, and the children." There was a pause on the line, a hesitation that lasted a second too long, and Vincent felt a spike of suspicion drive itself into his gut. "The children, boss?" Marco asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I didn't know there were children." Vincent closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the cold glass of the window. "Neither did I," he whispered, the admission tasting like bile. "Find her. I want the file on my desk before the sun comes up, or heads will roll." The sunrays over Chicago was usually a sight Vincent claimed as his own, a golden affirmation of his dominion over the waking city, but this morning the gray light filtering through the study windows looked like dirty water. He hadn't moved from his desk in 4 hours, his whiskey glass empty and sticky on the mahogany surface, waiting for the sound of Marco's footsteps in the hallway. When the door finally creaked open, the heavy oak dragging slightly on the plush carpet, Vincent didn't turn around, sensing the hesitation in his second-in-command stride. Marco placed a thick manila folder on the desk with a softness that was entirely out of character for a man who broke fingers for a living. "It's all there, boss," Marco said, his voice dropping to a rumble that vibrated with something dangerously close to pity. "But before you open it, you need to know that the intel team had to dig deep. She doesn't exist on the grid. She's invisible." Vincent spun his chair around and stared at the folder as if it were a bomb, his hands clenching into fists before he forced himself to reach out and flick the cover open. The first page was a summary of her current residence, and the address made bile rise in the back of his throat. She wasn't living in the suburbs or even a cramped apartment in the city center. She was in the red zone, a decaying cluster of tenements on the south side where ambulances waited for police escorts before entering. The building was listed as a code violation hazard with no central heating, broken security doors, and a landlord known for evicting tenants into the snow for being a day late. While Vincent slept on Egyptian cotton sheets in a climate-controlled fortress, the mother of his children was carrying 2 infants up 5 flights of stairs in a building where drug deals happened in the lobby. He turned the page to the financials, and the numbers hit him harder than a bullet to the vest. Scarlett wasn't just struggling, she was drowning under a mountain of debt that totaled $285,000. The breakdown was a litany of despair, listing high-interest predatory loans she had taken just to keep the lights on, compounded by a staggering bill from the neonatal intensive care unit. She was working 2 jobs to service the interest alone, pulling 12-hour shifts as a trauma nurse at Cook County where she dealt with gunshot victims and car crashes, then scrubbing floors as a janitor on the weekends. Vincent looked at his own hand, the heavy platinum watch on his wrist worth more than her entire annual salary, and felt a wave of self-loathing so potent it nearly knocked him out of his chair. The medical records were next, and this was where Vincent's composure finally shattered into irreparable dust. The twins, Leo and Luna, had been born at 30 weeks, their lungs undeveloped and their tiny bodies fighting for every single breath. The report noted that Scarlett had refused to leave the hospital, but because she couldn't afford the parking barrage fees, she had slept in a hard plastic chair in the lobby for 6 weeks. She had eaten from vending machines, washed in the public restroom, and then gone straight up to the NICU to hold her dying son's hand through the plastic port of an incubator. Vincent read the name on the birth certificate again, Leo Vincent Moretti, and a guttural sound tore from his chest. She had named the boy after him, honoring the man who was currently sipping expensive scotch while she starved herself to keep their son alive. Marco, Vincent said, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes never leaving the photo of a tiny baby with tubes taped to his face. Why didn't she call me? She knows who I am. She knows I have the money to fix this with a snap of my fingers. Why did she choose to suffer like this? The silence in the room stretched until it was suffocating, heavy with secrets that Marco clearly didn't want to spill. Vincent looked up, his steel gray eyes narrowing into slits that promised violence. Answer me. Did she try to reach me? Marco swallowed hard, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, looking for an exit that didn't exist. She did, boss, Marco admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. She came to the club 3 times. She came to the tower twice. Vincent stood up slowly, the air in the room turning electric with his rising fury. And, he prompted, his voice lethal. And the security team followed the clean break protocol you authorized after the breakup, Marco said rapidly, the words tumbling out. You said you wanted no contact. You said she was a liability. The guards at the gate, they thought she was looking for a handout. They threw her out. Vincent felt the blood drain from his face as a specific memory surfaced, a report from last winter about a woman causing a disturbance at the gate during a blizzard. They threw her out? Vincent repeated, his voice shaking. She was pregnant with my children, standing in the snow, and my men threw her onto the street? They blocked her number, boss, Marco added, sealing his own fate with the truth. They threatened her. They told her if she came back, they would make her disappear. The realization crashed into Vincent like a freight train, destroying the narrative he had built of himself as her noble protector. He wasn't the hero saving her from the darkness of his world, he was the monster who had cast her into the abyss. He had been dining in 5-star restaurants, discussing mergers and power, while his son gasped for air in a charity ward and his woman begged his own employees for mercy, only to be tossed aside like garbage. A roar of pure, unadulterated rage ripped through Vincent, primal and terrifying. He swept his arm across the desk, sending the crystal lamp, the expensive computer, and the bottle of whiskey crashing into the wall, shattering into 1,000 jagged shards. Get the car, he screamed, his voice cracking with the force of his emotion. Get the armored convoy ready now. We are going to the hospital. He didn't care about the meeting with the cartel, he didn't care about the wedding, and he didn't care about the war with Blackwood. The only thing that mattered was getting to Scarlett before the sun rose, before she spent one more second believing she was alone in this hell he had created. The parking lot of Cook County Hospital at 3 in the morning was a desolate wasteland of cracked asphalt and flickering amber lights that buzzed like dying insects. Vincent Moretti sat in the back of his armored SUV, his eyes fixed on the employee exit doors, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence that made his hands tremble. He watched nurses and orderlies stumble out into the biting wind, their shoulders hunched against the cold, but he was waiting for only one figure. When the doors finally slid open to reveal Scarlett, Vincent felt the air leave his lungs as if he had been punched in the gut. She looked even smaller than he remembered, her thin frame swallowed by a coat that had seen better days, her head bowed as she trudged toward the far end of the lot. She wasn't just walking, she was dragging herself, the exhaustion of a 12-hour shift radiating from every step she took on the icy ground. She reached a rusted Honda Civic parked in the darkest corner of the lot, a vehicle that looked like it was held together by duct tape and prayer. Vincent watched through his night vision optics as she fumbled with the keys, her fingers stiff with cold, before finally managing to unlock the door. She leaned into the back seat first, checking on 2 car seats that were strapped in with fraying belts, murmuring soft words that the wind carried away before they could reach him. She had picked up the children from the neighbor who watched them during her shift, and now she was trying to get them home to a freezing apartment before they woke up. She climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, but the engine only gave a sickly grind, a metal-on-metal screech that signaled the death of the starter motor. She tried again, and again, until finally, she just rested her forehead against the steering wheel, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs that tore Vincent apart from 50 yards away. He couldn't watch it anymore, couldn't sit in his heated leather sanctuary while the woman he loved broke down over a dead battery. Vincent opened the door and stepped out, his Italian leather shoes crunching softly on the snow as he moved toward her like a shadow detached from the night. He didn't want to scare her, but in a place like this, a man in a $3,000 suit was a threat no matter how slowly he walked. "Scarlett," he said, his voice rough with the emotions he was trying to strangle. She jerked upright, her survival instincts kicking in faster than he anticipated. She scrambled out of the car, slamming the door to protect the babies, and raised a small red canister of pepper spray with a hand that shook violently. "Stay back," she hissed, her eyes wide and feral. "I swear to God, I will blind you if you take another step." Vincent stopped, raising his hands to show he was unarmed, the gesture feeling foreign to a man who lived by the gun. "It's me, Scarlett. It's Vincent." He expected her to lower the weapon, expected her to maybe cry or scream, but he didn't expect the cold, hard hatred that settled over her features. "I know who you are," she spat, the words laced with venom. "You are the man who blocked my number. You are the man who had his guards throw me into a snowbank when I came to tell you about your son. What are you doing here, Vincent? Did you come to finish the job? Did you come to make sure we freeze to death this time?" Her accusations hit him like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of his defenses. "I didn't know," Vincent pleaded, taking a hesitant step forward, desperate to close the distance between them. "I swear on my life, Scarlett, I didn't know you came to me. I thought I was protecting you by staying away." She let out a bitter, jagged laugh that sounded like glass breaking. "Protecting me? You left me to starve, Vincent. Do you know what it's like to dilute formula because you have $3 to last until Friday? Do you know what it's like to hold your baby in a waiting room because you can't afford the copay for a doctor?" She took a step toward him, the pepper spray still raised, her fear transmuted into a mother's fury. "I begged you. I wrote letters. I screamed at your gate. And you sat in your tower and let us drown." Before Vincent could answer, before he could beg for a forgiveness he didn't deserve, the calm's peace in his ear crackled to life. "Boss," Marco's voice was urgent, cutting through the static. "We have bogeys. Black SUV, 3 blocks east, moving fast. It's a snatch team. Blackwood's men." The atmosphere shifted instantly, the regret in Vincent's eyes hardening into the steel of a dawn. The time for apologies was over, now was the time for war. "Get in the car," Vincent ordered, his voice dropping an octave, commanding and absolute. He didn't wait for her to argue. He moved past her, ignoring the pepper spray, and ripped open the back door of her Honda. "Don't you touch them." Scarlett screamed, lunging for him, but Vincent was already unbuckling the first car seat. "Scarlett, listen to me," he growled, working the straps with efficient, trembling hands. "Blackwood knows you are here. He has a team 2 minutes away. If we stay here, we all die. Do you understand?" He lifted the first carrier, seeing his son Leo for the first time, a tiny, pale face wrapped in a blanket that was too thin for the weather. The boy's eyes were wide, staring up at him with a curiosity that broke Vincent's heart all over again. He handed the carrier to a stunned Scarlett and reached for Luna. "Get in my car. Now." The reality of the threat punched through Scarlett's anger, her gaze darting to the dark street entrance where headlights were sweeping across the snow. She grabbed Leo, clutching the carrier to her chest, and ran toward the idling armored convoy. Vincent followed with Luna, his body acting as a human shield between his family and the darkness. He shoved them into the back of the Rolls-Royce, the warmth of the interior hitting them like a physical wall, and slammed the heavy, bulletproof door just as a black SUV screeched around the corner. "Go," Vincent barked at the driver as he jumped into the front seat. "Get us to the estate. Use the evasion route." As the convoy tore out of the lot, leaving the rusted Honda behind, Vincent looked back through the partition. Scarlett was huddled in the corner, her body curled protectively around the twins, staring at him with a mixture of terror and confusion. He had saved them from the cold, but he knew the real danger was just beginning. The iron gates of the Moretti estate closed behind the armored convoy with a finality that echoed like a prison door slamming shut, locking out the snow and the danger of the Chicago night. Scarlett stepped out of the car, clutching Leo to her chest while Vincent carried Luna, and the sheer scale of the house hit her like a physical weight. The foyer was a cavern of white marble and crystal chandeliers that refracted light into 1,000 blinding diamonds, a stark contrast to the peeling paint and flickering bulbs of her walk-up in the red zone. She hesitated on the threshold, looking down at her worn canvas sneakers that were stained with gray slush and road salt, terrified to take a step and soil the pristine perfection of Vincent's world. This place smelled of old money and lemon polish, a scent so sharp and clean it made her dizzy after months of breathing in damp drywall and exhaust fumes. Vincent didn't seem to notice her hesitation. He walked straight in, his Italian leather shoes clicking rhythmically on the stone, carrying his daughter with a tenderness that looked terrifyingly unnatural on a man built for violence. He led her upstairs to a room that had clearly been prepared in a frenzy, smelling of fresh paint and new timber. It was a nursery, but not just any nursery. It was a sanctuary filled with soft lighting, plush rugs, and 2 cribs made of solid oak that probably cost more than Scarlett made in a year. She stood in the center of the room, feeling like an intruder in her own life, clutching Leo so tight he let out a small squeak of protest. "Put him down, Scarlett," Vincent said softly, standing by the other crib where he had already settled Luna. "You are exhausted. Your hands are shaking." She wanted to argue, wanted to scream that she didn't trust him, but her body betrayed her, her knees buckled, and she had to lean against the wall just to stay upright. She lowered Leo into the crib, her fingers brushing the silk sheets, and the baby fell asleep instantly, surrounded by warmth he had never known. Vincent moved to the changing table where a bottle warmer was already humming, his large, scarred hands fumbling slightly with the delicate plastic of the formula scoop. It was a surreal tableau, the most feared Don in Chicago, still wearing his 3-piece suit, measuring out powdered milk with the intense focus of a bomb disposal expert. He spilled a little powder on the counter and swore under his breath, wiping it away with a silk handkerchief before shaking the bottle vigorously. "I paid the debt," he said suddenly, not looking at her as he tested the milk temperature on his wrist. "The $285,000. It is gone. I also bought the loan company that was harassing you and dissolved their assets." Scarlett froze, the breath catching in her throat as the magnitude of his words sank in. That debt had been a noose around her neck, a heavy chain dragging her under every single day, and he had severed it with a casual sentence. "I didn't ask you to do that," she whispered, her pride flaring up even as her relief washed over her. "I don't want your charity." "It isn't charity." Vincent turned to face her, his eyes dark with a guilt that looked like physical pain. "It is penance. That debt was my fault. You carried it because I wasn't there." He handed her the bottle, his fingers brushing hers, sending a jolt of electricity through her exhausted nerves. "Sleep, Scarlett. There are guards at the door. No one gets in without my order." She didn't have the strength to fight him anymore. She sank into the plush armchair in the corner, intending to just close her eyes for a moment, but the silence and safety of the room pulled her into a deep, dreamless coma. The peace was shattered the next morning by the sharp, staccato rhythm of high heels striking the marble floor downstairs, growing louder and angrier with every step. Scarlett woke with a start, her heart pounding, her instinct screaming danger as she scrambled out of the chair and stood protectively in front of the cribs. The door to the nursery flew open, not with a knock, but with a violent shove, revealing a woman who looked like an ice queen carved from diamonds and spite. Natasha Sinclair stood there in a white fur coat, her eyes sweeping over the room with a look of absolute disgust that made Scarlett feel dirty just by being seen. "So it is true," Natasha sneered, her lip curling as she looked at the sleeping babies. "I thought the rumors were exaggerated. I didn't think you would actually bring the stray dog and her litters into our home." Vincent appeared in the doorway a second later, his face a mask of cold fury, but Natasha didn't back down. She pointed a manicured finger at Scarlett, her voice rising to a shriek that woke Leo, making him wail in terror. "Get them out, Vincent. My father is on his way. If he sees this trash in the house he paid for, the merger is dead." Scarlett shrank back, the old shame of being invisible and unwanted clawing at her throat, but then Vincent stepped between them. He didn't yell, he went deadly quiet, the kind of silence that fell before a gunshot. "This isn't your house, Natasha," he said, his voice low and vibrating with menace. "And these aren't letters. They are my children." Natasha laughed, a brittle, incredulous sound. "Your children? You are going to throw away $1 billion alliance for 2 bastards and a washerwoman?" She took a step toward the cribs, her face twisted in hate. "Look at them. They are weak. They are nothing." Something inside Vincent snapped, an audible crack in his composure that filled the room with terrifying energy. He grabbed Natasha's arm, his grip bruising, and shoved her toward the door. "The wedding is off," he declared, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence to the Sinclair family's ambitions. "The merger is dead. Get out of my house before I forget that I was raised not to hit women." Natasha stumbled into the hallway, catching herself on the doorframe, her face pale with shock that quickly morphed into pure, unadulterated venom. "You will regret this," she hissed, her eyes locking onto Scarlett over Vincent's shoulder. "You will burn for this, Vincent. I will make sure of it." The cancellation of the Sinclair merger sent shockwaves through Chicago that were measured in billions, the family stock plummeting like a stone dropped in a deep well. Vincent stood in his study, listening to the relentless ringing of 3 different phones, observing the chaos of his business empire collapsing with a detachment that frightened his kapos. They saw ruin, but he saw the price of admission for the life he was currently living, a life where he could walk down the hall and hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of his children. He unplugged the main line, silencing the panicked voices of investors who cared more about profit margins than human life, and walked out of the room, leaving the wreckage of his former ambitions behind him without a backward glance. He found Scarlett in the library, not reading, but staring at the fire with a look of disbelief, as if she expected the warmth to be repossessed at any moment. She was safe, she was warm, and her debt was gone, but the haunted look in her eyes told him that the internal scars would take much longer to heal than her bank account. That night, the silence of the estate was shattered not by a gun, but by a scream that tore through the heavy oak door of the guest suite. Vincent was moving before his conscious mind woke up, sprinting down the hallway with his handgun drawn, bursting into Scarlett's room expecting an assassin. Instead, he found her thrashing in the sheets, fighting off invisible demons that smelled like hospital antiseptic and eviction notices. He holstered the weapon and climbed onto the bed, pulling her shaking frame against his chest, anchoring her to the present with the weight of his body and the steady beat of his heart. "It is okay," he whispered into her hair, rocking her as she sobbed, the terror of 14 months of survival bleeding out of her. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his shirt, the barrier between them dissolving in the heat of her panic. "I named him Leo Vincent," she choked out, the confession wet with tears against his chest. "I wanted to hate you, Vincent. I tried so hard to hate you, but I couldn't look at him and not see the only man I ever loved." While the Moretti estate slept in a fragile peace, a very different meeting was taking place in the VIP lounge of a club on the north side. Natasha Sinclair sat across from Richard Blackwood, the dim red lighting casting shadows that made her face look like a skull beneath her perfect makeup. She didn't look like a heartbroken fiancée, she looked like a general negotiating a nuclear strike, her finger tracing the rim of a crystal glass as she laid a digital tablet on the table. "You want the shipping routes," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, offering up the lifeblood of Vincent's empire like it was a party favor. "I can give you the access codes, the schedules, and the bribe lists for the Port Authority. It is everything you need to break him." Blackwood leaned forward, his eyes glinting with greed, sensing the kill he had waited 2 decades for. "And the price?" he asked, knowing nothing this valuable came cheap. "Burn them," Natasha replied, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "I don't want them dead quickly. I want Vincent to watch his little family turn to ash while I watch from the front row." The attack didn't begin with an explosion, but with a click that plunged the Moretti estate into absolute, suffocating darkness. In the security room, the guard Vincent had trusted for 5 years, a man whose gambling debts Natasha had quietly paid off that morning, typed a command that disabled the perimeter alarms. He opened the service entrance, letting the winter wind howl through the corridors, carrying with it the heavy, clanking sound of metal canisters rolling across the marble floor. Up in the nursery, Vincent woke to the hissing sound, a serpentine noise that triggered every survival instinct he possessed. He smelled it a second later, the sickly sweet odor of sleeping gas mixed with the acrid scent of smoke, and he knew instantly that the war he thought he had avoided was standing in his living room. He rolled out of bed, grabbing his weapon, but the air was already thick, and the screams of the twins echoed from the nursery like a siren signaling the end of the world. The smoke that filled the hallway of the Moretti estate was a living thing, thick and serpentine, tasting of sulfur and the acrid burn of tear gas that stung Vincent's eyes and throat. He moved through the haze like a phantom, his weapon drawn and steady, stepping over the unconscious bodies of his own security team who had been taken down by the insider betrayal. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, not from fear of the gas or the intruders, but from the terrifying silence that was pouring out of the nursery at the end of the hall. He kicked the door open, ready to fire, but the room was empty, the cribs overturned and the window shattered, letting the freezing winter wind swirl a lingering smoke into ghostly shapes. On the plush white rug, right where he had knelt yesterday to play with his daughter, lay a single tiny pink sock, abandoned and small. Vincent picked it up, his hand trembling for the first time in a decade, and crushed the fabric in his fist until his knuckles turned white. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a singular buzz that felt like a detonator going off in the silence. He answered without speaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps that sounded loud in the dead room. Dock 7, the old chemical refinery, Richard Blackwood's voice crackled over the line, smooth and triumphant, the sound of a man who had waited 20 years to deliver a checkmate. "Come alone, Vincent. If I see a single police car, if I see a single armored truck, I will drop the cage. You have 30 minutes before I start the mixers." The line went dead before Vincent could utter a threat, leaving him standing in the ruins of the sanctuary he had tried to build. He didn't scream. He didn't smash the phone. He went into a state of cold, absolute zero focus, the kind of detachment that allowed a man to walk into hell without blinking. He bypassed his remaining guards, ignored Marco's plea to wait for backup, and got into his fastest car, a black coupe that roared to life like a beast waking up. He drove through the city at speeds that blurred the streetlights into streaks of neon blood, his mind replaying the image of that tiny pink sock over and over again. The refinery rose out of the industrial wasteland like the skeleton of a dead giant, rusted towers and twisting pipes silhouetted against the dark sky, smelling of rot and volatile chemicals. Vincent parked the car in the open, headlights cutting through the gloom, and walked toward the main bay doors with his hands raised, his coat open to show he was unarmed. The warehouse was cavernous, echoing with the drip of leaking pipes and the hum of machinery that shouldn't have been running. In the center of the room, illuminated by harsh floodlights, was a nightmare constructed specifically for him. A rusted iron cage was suspended 20 feet in the air by a heavy chain, hanging precariously over a massive industrial mixing vat that churned with a dark, viscous liquid. Inside the cage, Leo and Luna were huddled together, their terrified cries lost in the vastness of the space. Scarlet was tied to a railing on the catwalk below them, her face bruised and bloodied, struggling against zip ties that cut into her wrists. "Welcome to the end of the line, Moretti," Blackwood called out, stepping from the shadows on the catwalk, flanked by Natasha, who was holding a red emergency flare. "I told you that weakness would be your undoing. You traded an empire for a nurse and 2 mistakes." Vincent stopped in the center of the concrete floor, his eyes locking onto Scarlet's terrified gaze, telegraphing a promise he hoped he could keep. "Let them go, Richard," Vincent said, his voice echoing calmly through the space, betraying none of the panic that was clawing at his gut. "This is between you and me. Let the mother and the children leave, and I will stay. I will sign over the territories. I will sign over the shipping routes. You can have it all." Natasha laughed, a jagged sound that bounced off the metal walls. "We don't want the territory, Vincent," she sneered, popping the cap off the flare. "We want you to feel what it's like to lose everything. I want you to watch them burn." Vincent didn't look at her, he looked past her, toward a shadowed vent in the high ceiling where a faint shimmer of movement caught his trained eye. He tapped his fingers against his thigh, a signal he and Marco had developed years ago in the trenches of a gang war. "You were making a mistake, Natasha," Vincent said softly, buying time with words while his muscles coiled like springs. "Fire is hard to control. It consumes everything." Natasha struck the flare, the brilliant red light hissing to life, casting demonic shadows across her face. "That is the point," she whispered, and raised her arm to throw the flare into the chemical vat below the cage. At that exact second, the floodlights shattered, plunging the warehouse into absolute darkness as a sniper shot from the vent took out the main breaker. Vincent moved. He didn't run, he exploded into motion, navigating the darkness by memory and instinct. He heard Blackwood shout an order, heard the muzzle flash of a gun firing blindly, but Vincent was already on the catwalk. He tackled Blackwood, driving his shoulder into the older man's gut, sending them both crashing into the metal railing. It was a brutal, ugly fight, fists connecting with bone in the dark, breaths coming in grunts of pain. Vincent took a hard knee to the ribs but didn't slow down. He grabbed Blackwood's head and slammed it against the steel grate, silencing the rival dawn with a sickening crunch. But across the catwalk, the red glow of the flare was still sputtering on the floor where Natasha had dropped it. The chemicals in the vat below caught a spark, and with a whoosh of displaced air, the mixer ignited. A pillar of fire roared upward, licking at the bottom of the suspended cage where the twins were screaming. "The winch!" Scarlet screamed, her voice tearing through the roar of the fire. "Vincent, the winch is jammed." Vincent scrambled up the ladder to the control platform, ignoring the heat that was already blistering the skin on his face. The mechanism was fused, the chain stuck. He looked at the cage, barely 5 feet away now but separated by a chasm of open air and rising flames. He didn't hesitate. He climbed onto the railing and leaped, catching the rusted bars of the cage with his bare hands. The metal seared his palms, but he pulled himself up, hanging over the inferno, and kicked the door latch until it snapped. "Scarlet," he roared, looking down to where Marco had just cut her free. "Catch them." He reached into the cage, grabbing a terrified Leo, and dropped him into the waiting arms of his mother below. Then he grabbed Luna, wrapping her in his jacket, and dropped her safely a second later. "Jump, boss!" Marco yelled from the ground. "The chain is melting." Vincent prepared to let go, to fall to the concrete and hope his legs would hold, but movement caught his eye. Blackwood wasn't unconscious. He was propped up against the railing, blood streaming down his face, holding a heavy-caliber pistol with shaking hands. He wasn't aiming at Vincent. He was aiming at Scarlett, who was running toward the exit with the babies in her arms. Time seemed to stretch into a single, agonizingly slow second. Vincent saw the finger tighten on the trigger. He saw the barrel line up with Scarlett's spine. He knew he couldn't reach Blackwood. He knew he couldn't shout loud enough to make her dodge. There was only one variable he could control. Vincent let go of the cage, but he didn't drop straight down. He threw his body backward, kicking off the metal frame to propel himself into the line of fire. The sound of the gunshots was deafening, 3 booms that overlapped like a single thunderclap. Bang. 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 Vincent felt the impact like a sledgehammer. The first bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second punched through his ribs. The third hit him center mass, stealing the breath from his lungs. He hit the concrete floor with a bone-shattering thud, his vision instantly graying at the edges. Above him, the cage groaned and plummeted into the fire, sending a wave of heat washing over him. He heard Marco return fire, a final decisive shot that ended Blackwood's miserable life, and then there was only the roar of the flames and the sound of his own blood rushing in his ears. He lay on his back, staring up at the smoke-filled ceiling, feeling the cold concrete leaching the heat from his body even as the fire raged feet away. He couldn't feel his legs. The pain in his chest was dulling into a strange, distant numbness. He tried to take a breath, but his lungs were full of fluid. Vincent. The scream was raw, primal. Scarlett was there, dropping to her knees beside him, her hands pressing frantically onto his chest, trying to hold his life inside his body. Her tears fell onto his face, hot and salty, mixing with the sudden blood. "No, no, no," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "You don't get to do this. You promised. You promised you wouldn't leave." Vincent looked up at her, fighting the darkness that was creeping in from the corners of his vision. He wanted to wipe the tears from her face, but his arms wouldn't obey his commands. He saw Marco standing guard over the babies a few feet away, saw that they were safe, that they were alive. He summoned every ounce of strength he had left, forcing his lips to move one last time. He wheezed, blood bubbling past his lips. "I paid the debt." His eyes slid closed, the roar of the fire fading into a long, peaceful silence as the world went black. The sterile white hallway of the ICU felt colder than the winter street where Vincent had found her, a purgatory of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic, terrifying beep of life support machines. Scarlett sat in a hard plastic chair that dug into her spine, her clothes still stained with the soot of the chemical fire and the dried blood of the man who had jumped in front of a bullet for her. She had been there for 48 hours, refusing to leave even when the nurses begged her to go home and rest, terrified that if she looked away for a second, the fragile thread holding Vincent to this world would snap. She held a rosary she hadn't touched since childhood, her fingers moving over the beads with a desperate, silent plea to a god she thought had abandoned her years ago. When the surgeon finally emerged, looking exhausted and grim, Scarlett stopped breathing until he pulled off his cap and gave a small, weary nod. He told her that Vincent Moretti was made of iron, that the bullets had missed his heart by millimeters, and that against all medical logic, the King of Chicago was going to live. The first thing Vincent saw when he opened his eyes was not the ceiling of a hospital room, but the image of Scarlett sleeping in the chair beside his bed, her head resting on the mattress near his hand. The pain in his chest was a dull, constant roar, a reminder of the metal that had torn through him, but it paled in comparison to the warmth of her fingers laced through his. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry as sandpaper, so he simply squeezed her hand, a weak signal that he had returned from the dark. Scarlett woke instantly, her eyes wide and red-rimmed, and for a moment she just stared at him as if he were a ghost. Then she broke, burying her face in the sheets beside his hip, sobbing with a relief that shook the bed frame. Vincent reached out with his good arm, stroking her hair with a trembling hand, and whispered the only words that mattered. He told her he was done with the life, that the debt was paid, and that he was never leaving her again. Recovery was a slow, agonizing war of inches, but Vincent fought it with the same ferocity he had once used to rule the underworld. He spent the long weeks of rehabilitation liquidating his empire, selling off the casinos, the clubs, and the territories that had been bought with blood. He placed Marco in charge of dissolving the criminal assets, turning the Moretti legacy into a legitimate foundation that funded pediatric wings in hospitals across the state. He traded his armored Rolls-Royce for a family SUV, traded his tailored suits for soft cotton shirts that didn't irritate his scars, and traded the fear of a city for the love of his family. It wasn't an easy transition for a man who had spent 37 years as a predator, but every time he watched Leo and Luna crawling across the living room rug, he knew he had made the only trade that was worth a damn. 6 months after the fire, the summer sun bathed the private garden of their new home in a golden light that felt like forgiveness. The house was far from the city, a quiet sanctuary surrounded by trees and the sound of birds rather than sirens. Vincent sat on a wooden bench, watching Leo chase a butterfly across the grass with a clumsy, joyous run, while Luna sat in the clover picking flowers with serious concentration. Scarlett sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder, her hand resting comfortably on his knee. The scars on his chest still ached when it rained, a permanent map of the night he almost died, but he wore them like medals of honor. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple velvet box, turning to face the woman who had saved him in every way a person could be saved. "Scarlett," Vincent said, his voice steady and clear, free of the darkness that had once defined him. "You gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve one. You loved me when I was unlovable. You gave me a family when I thought I was destined to die alone." He opened the box to reveal a diamond ring, not flashy or ostentatious, but pure and brilliant in the sunlight. "I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel cold or alone again. Will you marry me?" Scarlett looked from the ring to his eyes, tears of happiness spilling over her cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She slid the ring onto her finger, and then she did something that made the world stop spinning. She took Vincent's large, scarred hand and placed it gently on her stomach, pressing his palm against the warmth of her skin. "Yes," she whispered, her smile radiant enough to outshine the sun. "I will marry you. But we are going to need a bigger house." Vincent looked at her, confusion clouding his eyes for a second before the realization hit him like a physical blow. He stared at his hand on her belly, then back at her face, his jaw dropping as the math clicked into place. "You missed the first two," Scarlett said softly, covering his hand with hers. "You missed the first steps and the first words. But you are here now, Vincent. You won't miss this one." Tears welled in the eyes of the former Don, the man who had once been made of stone, as he pulled his wife into a kiss that sealed their future. He had almost lost everything in the fire, but from the ashes, he had built a life that was finally, truly whole. Vincent's journey teaches us that it is never too late to rewrite your story, no matter how dark the early chapters might have been. It reminds us that true strength isn't found in power or money, but in the courage to sacrifice for the people we love. Here at Sunni Romance, we believe that every heart deserves a second chance and that family is the most precious treasure of all. If this story touched your soul, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so we can keep bringing you these emotional journeys every day. We want to hear from you in the comments below. Do you believe that a person can truly change for love, or are some past too dark to leave behind? Let us know what you think. Until next time, keep your heart open, because you never know when your own miracle might be waiting just around the corner.